What I'm going to do in this video is just go through the 4 pieces of output that I ask you to put in your Google Sheets, and then give an overall interpretive comment. There's plenty of other details we could go into, and we'll look at some of those in the Explore section this week. So the first thing I ask you to look for is, was there a statistically significant interaction effect? And the first output you're looking at is this ANOVA table. Well, that interaction effect is talking about this third row right here that has that funky asterisk in it. And so when I ask you if there was a significant interaction effect, you're looking at this p-value right here. As usual, if it's below 0.05, we say that yes, there is statistical significance, so there would be a statistically significant interaction effect. If it's above 0.05, we're going to say no. This eta squared, almost always we actually use partial eta squared. I'll get into those differences in the Explore section. But this can think of it roughly as an r squared. So we could convert it to a percent. Here it would be 0.1%. So we don't have statistical significance or practical significance here on the interaction term. Interpreting the eta squared or the partial eta squared, again, think of it roughly as an r squared. If it's 1%, might be a weak effect, maybe 9–10% would be a medium effect, 25–30% would be a strong effect. Again, that's somewhat arbitrary, but gives you a sense of what a practical effect would be there. So if this interaction term is not statistically significant, like you see with mine, then you would move up and interpret each of what are called the main effects. If it is significant, if it is below 0.05, you really don't want to look at the 2 rows above it. It becomes a more complicated situation. For this assignment, you'll go ahead and look at those anyway. And we'll talk more in the Explore section about how you should handle that. But if this is below 0.05, you really shouldn't go up here. If it's above 0.05, like what I have, then you go up and look at what are called the main effects. So here then we interpret this in the same way. So our p-value here is below 0.05. So race would be a statistically significant main effect, not a large effect size, so not very practically significant, but it would be statistically significant. In other words, the p-value is evidence against, the lower the p-value is, the more evidence there is against the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis here being that all of my 6 race categories get the same average amount of sleep per night. So that's pretty clearly not true, even though it's not a huge effect. For sex, the null hypothesis would be male and female get the same average amount of sleep per night. That is not statistically significant, so I don't know that they do get the same amount per night, but I certainly don't have evidence that they're getting different amounts of sleep per night on average. So that's how we interpret that main ANOVA table. So the post hocs are going to look at the main effects. Again, if you had a significant interaction effect, you wouldn't do post hocs, or at least it gets a little trickier for your main effects. However, for this, I want you to go ahead and do it anyway. So I want to take whichever one of these terms, including it could be the interaction effect, whichever one has the lowest p-value, and that's what you should have run here. So for me, I wrote race, and what this table does is it really kind of runs t-tests between every possible pair of groups on this. So this is race, so this would be white versus black, white versus Asian, white versus American Indian, Alaskan, white versus Hispanic, white versus other, and then this would be black versus Asian. So every possible pairwise comparison I can make. It shows me the average difference in numbers of hours per sleep. So for example, this 1, 2, this is white group here, this is blacks. What I'm seeing here is that whites on average in this sample got 0.2 hours on average more sleep per night than the black participants in this survey. Whereas this one's negative, so that would say the whites got 0.04 less than hours of sleep per night, less than the Asians who answered the survey did. We have our standard error t. What we can jump to here is the Tukey. And this is, again, a p-value. Tukey is the test that's adjusting for the multiple comparison aspect here. So we could say, I ask you how many comparisons were statistically significant. That means how many of these are below 0.05. So right here we have one, here we have one, and looks like that's all we have. So we really just have 2 statistically significant results here. And then I ask you, which difference was the most statistically significant? Well, these two were the same. The difference between white and black in the amount of sleep, and the difference between white and Hispanic was also statistically significant. So those are the only 2 that were statistically significant, and mine were the same. If you had one that was less than all the rest, you would say that that particular difference was the most statistically significant. Moving down to the descriptives. So here again, I know that the white and blacks are apparently getting a significantly different amount of sleep, and I also know that the whites and Hispanics are getting a significantly different amount of sleep. But until I jump down here, it's harder to put that into a plain English context. The descriptives, the next 2, really is what makes things start to make a little sense. So if I'm looking for the lowest mean, these are giving me the average amount of sleep per night. These are the specific categories. So I have 6 race categories: white, black, Asian, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Hispanic, and other. And then my sex, 1 is male and 2 is female. So you can see I have 12 groups here. This line right here would be giving me the white males, then the white females, then the black males, black females, and so on. And for each row, I can see the average of all the people who responded from within that group. I can see the average amount of sleep there. So notice in my case, the highest one was this. Some category is getting 7.14 hours, or at least reporting 7.14 hours of sleep per night. That would be the Asian males. So somewhat contrary to what I would have guessed, at least in this survey of the thousands responding, there may not have been a lot of Asian males in the study. That's another thing we could look at. But it looked like the Asian males did get the most sleep. So my next question, especially on a category that could be a pretty low sample size, was, well, how many Asian males were even in the sample? And luckily that is given to us right here. So we can see there were 98 males, which is a fairly high sample size for doing an average. I mean, we'd like to get about 30 or more if it's a good representative sample, which this survey data should be. So it really does report these Asian males are reporting more hours of sleep per night. What I ask you is to find the least one, which would be, in my case, 6.526 right here. So I say describe it in plain English. What I mean is, I don't want you to just say, okay, 5.2 had 6.5. that's not plain English. These 5 are people. They're Hispanics. So this would be the Hispanic female group. So of all the groups in my survey, the Hispanic females got the lowest amount of sleep per night, or reported the lowest amount of sleep per night, at 6.5 hours of sleep per night. So I'm putting this number, I'm putting the units back on. I'm letting the reader, you're letting me know that you understand what the units are there. So 6.5 hours of sleep on average per night. Okay, descriptives plot. Here's where you can get into some really interesting understanding of the data. This is also where you really need to go to interpret the interactions that are going on, because what this does is it peels things apart by race and gender, or biological sex. So for example, let's say a reasonable question would be, do blacks and Asians get different amount of sleep? And here's a case where I would say it depends, because if we're talking about males, this is the average amount of sleep for each of the races per night. So this is 3. This is the Asian group. Oh, those are the Asian males that we just looked at right up there. So Asian males are getting quite a bit more sleep than black males are. But if we're talking about females, Asian and black females, at least in this sample, we're getting exactly the same amount of, or pretty much exactly the same amount of sleep. And we could say the same for this would be the American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and this here would be the other category. So for the males of those two groups, there's at least a difference in the sample, and for the females, there really wasn't. So this helps you start to sort out if the answer is it depends on which groups you're looking at. This helps you start to see where the differences might be taking place. And then you could run specific post hoc comparisons for whatever it is. So maybe I would look at specifically between the so here, let me just back up a second. If I look between Asians and blacks, so I guess that'd be 2 and 3. Blacks and Asians. Notice that I didn't have a significant difference there. But looking here, I'd be surprised if there's not a significant difference there between the male Asians and the male blacks. And so that's a specific post hoc test that I could look into. Once I start doing that, once I start cherry picking, looking at my specific results, I have to be a little careful. That can get into p-hacking and trying to find a result where it may just exist in the sample. So those would be some interesting things. I might also notice that for whites, it doesn't seem to matter too much if you're male or female. You get about the same amount of sleep, but for some of the other races, it really does matter, male or female. So overall, this is the 5th thing you need to do. An overall comment, I would say, is that it does look like there's some differences in sleep. Particularly, whites appear to be getting significantly more sleep than whites appear to be getting significantly more sleep than blacks or Hispanics. Hispanics appear to be getting the least amount of sleep overall, and for some reason Asian males appear to be getting a lot more sleep than black males, even though Asian and black females are getting about the same amount of sleep. Those would be some overall things I might say here.